Fiona's actually covered a lot of the things, or some of the things that I was going to look at because earlier today, and so I'll go through these relatively quickly. But I would like to emphasise the point that it is really important that you do understand some of these government documents and regulations. They often, I mean, they're not the most captivating reading necessarily, though they can be very interesting, and they certainly can feed a lot into decisions and discussions that you have. I mean, you're often going to be in the position where you tell to somebody who wants to do something, we can't do that because the government won't allow it. It's always nice to be able to say that because it shuts people up, but it is actually sometimes even true. So, and that's certainly true. I mean, the point about earlier about the professionalism of supervisors, the government is increasingly buying into that. Have to be research active, have to have, as Fiona said, the qualification above or at least at the level of the people they're supervising. Those are just kind of non-negotiable. And a lot of these other things are pretty close to that as well. So, I mean, I won't go through those because Fiona's really covered those well already, but I certainly would recommend you having a look at a lot of those documents because they do clarify a lot of the circumstances that we and cases that we deal with. The next thing is to say about the ACGR and the ACGR website. The ACGR website is a terrific resource, and it has a huge number of documents. All of the ones I think that I'm going to touch on, there are links to these documents under the resources tab, I think, on the ACGR website. So please access that. It has great information about all the different standards documents, all the submissions the ACGR has made to the government, basically all the government reviews that have been going on recently, and they are really worth following. If you don't know the password to the ACGR website, your DDOG or Dean should. But I mean, heaps of these documents are a great resource, and I think all of the things that I talk about there are links to on that website, and there's lots of other resources as well that I'd really recommend you having a look at. So important amongst them is the ACGR's statement on good practice, and that's the Australian Graduate Research Good Practice Principles, and they cover these 6 areas. So selection and admission, candidature, candidate development, resources and intellectual climate, supervision and examination. They basically spell out what are the minimum requirements for a satisfactory HDR system at your university. And most of those you'll find you do comply with, some of them you won't. Sometimes the document will give an emphasis to something that is unexpected for you or that hasn't really been a priority at your institution. Certainly it'd be worth knowing them. I don't think it does now, but in the last iteration of the government's threshold standards, it did identify at each part of the threshold standards, it identified what it called reference points, which were documents that, or resources that you could use to explain and justify and benchmark your practice. And in research training, the only one that it linked to was this one. And I don't think that does it still do that? Okay, so this does have a kind of government endorsement in the sense that it is the one language that you can use that is a really effective way of explaining, justifying, mapping what you're doing. So I think that's something really worth getting to know well. Conflict of, I think Jonathan talked about this already, the conflict of interest in examination principles are ones that every university has committed to signing up. It identifies 44 possible conflicts of interest in examination. Some of them you would think were bleedingly obvious, like you can't get your partner to examine someone's thesis. These issues do actually come up. We had somebody who wanted to have their partner as their supervisor, and it took a long time to explain to them why that was conflict of interest. They did come back with the argument, but I'll have really good access to their time. And that didn't quite get that proposal across the line, I have to say. Okay. It also has a document from the Institute of Professional Editors, which explains an agreement between the ACGR and the Institute about what it's possible for professional editors to do in HDR theses. What's surprising about it when you look at it in detail is what professional editors, what the Institute commits to is actually very minimal. And it's really important for you and supervisors to understand exactly what the Institute and the ACGR have agreed is acceptable practice. Professional editors can actually do not much. They can do basically grammar and expression and punctuation. They can't even do things like moving paragraphs around. They will not. That is a supervisor's responsibility. A lot of supervisors, we've had problems with supervisors, especially of candidates where English isn't their first language. The supervisor has wanted to wash their hands of any responsibility for editing, saying a professional editor will do that. Professional editor will help with really basics in English expression. They won't do the any editorial work that looks like it impacts on content is purely a supervisor's responsibility. So I'd have a look at that. It has links to all their schedules of different things that editors are able to do. Fiona's also mentioned this, the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research. These are around the issues of ethics, integrity and authorship. And again, it's always worth knowing what the national standards and even international standards in these areas are. The Singapore Statement, the Vancouver Protocol. Singapore Statement is broader. This is an international agreement covering issues of research integrity. And the Vancouver Protocol I couldn't actually find a link to that, but it is possible to find the Vancouver Protocol on a number of university websites. The really specific way, the Vancouver Protocol is also broad. It covers a number of issues, but it's most important in the issue of authorship and what somebody has to do in order to claim rights as an author. And that same claim has funneled through to the code. So it's important that you know those documents. We do get cases of candidates coming to us and saying, my supervisor insists having their name on my research papers. And basically, if they have not met the requirements that are listed in the code, and again, they're quite restrictive, then they cannot be an author. Now, heaps of disciplines, I have to say, their standard practices fall outside of these protocols. There are a number of disciplines which have huge authorship lists, and where that is common practice, and the overwhelming majority of those authors would not meet the requirements of these codes. So it is a very delicate and tricky issue to deal with, but HDR candidates are often at the really pointy end of these discussions, and they're because of their position, sometimes because of their age, they can be intimidated. So it is really important that you're familiar with these expectations. Okay, so frameworks, researcher development frameworks. And again, there are several, but probably the most famous is the VTI framework from the UK. That's the overall map of the VTI framework, which covers 4 key areas in researcher development. So engagement, influence and impact, knowledge and intellectual ability, personal effectiveness, research governance and organisation. It's an attempt to comprehensively chart the things that a developing researcher might need support and development in order to advance to a more professional level. VTI is hugely influential, especially in the UK, and it's used by a lot of jurisdictions. And I think some members of ACGR also have signed up to VTI, I think, as well. Probably the consensus around VTI is that framework is very useful. Not all of the other resources that VTI provides are necessarily things that you need to buy into. But the framework itself, which is open access, is a very good way to kind of chart, if you're looking at professional and researcher development, HDR development in terms of transferable skills as well as research skills in preparation for an academic career or a research career or professional development more generally, it's a pretty good map of the bases that you might need to cover. We've also got Joe Luca at Edith Cowan has also developed a very comprehensive good practice framework in research training, which covers a lot of comparable things. That's pretty easy to access on the ECU website, but it's also an attempt to comprehensively map what an education of an HDR candidate might be. These are resources that you can use of course they're not prescriptive or they're not restrictive, so but they are good in the sense that they represent very elaborate, detailed, comprehensive work and attempt to provide a full model of what researcher training could and should cover. Okay, feedback, blogs and conferences. I think Fiona mentioned earlier, or somebody mentioned earlier, the PREC questionnaire. This the PREC questionnaire, it stands for Postgraduate Research Experience Questionnaire, is undertaking quite a substantial amount of change. I think, is it going to be called PRES in future? Or is it? No. Okay. We're still kind of in a holding pattern about what the future of that is. But it does apply a questionnaire to all completing HDR candidates. Its actual take-up rate is not as high, of course, as we would like it to be, but it does provide good information and indication not only about your own institution, but around national patterns as well. And we've actually calibrated our internal research experience questionnaire to the PREC so that we can measure the statistics that we get from about the experience of successful completed graduates looking back, and also current candidates during candidature. And we compare how those two are going. Of course, the experience of the completed candidates who are happy to complete a questionnaire is often more positive than current candidates who are still anxious, uncertain if they're going to complete, and so on. But it is a really interesting indicator of progress that you might have made if you've put in place new developments, whether they've improved the experience of candidates, whether candidates are connecting with them. All that is really valuable information. 2 blogs that are very valuable to sign up to: the Thesis Whisperer, run out of Bainga from ANU, which is like a globally famous blog on HDR experience. But it's also spawned the Thesis, the Supervision Whisperer as well, which is dealing with the same kind of issues, similar HDR issues. I mean, not every post is going to be relevant to you, but it is also actually a great way of the posts are sourced from different institutions, from around the world, from candidates at different stages of development, from supervisors. It's a really great insight into the subjectivity of candidature, I think, more than anything else. And for me, it's been a great insight into the kind of issues that candidates might be going on in candidates' mind that don't necessarily come to the fore, but that you do need to know about when dealing with individuals and individual cases. And I think finally the last thing is just about 2 conferences that are loosely coordinated with one another. And one is the Quality in Postgraduate Research, probably the most prominent, I think internationally, the most prominent conference run in Adelaide in even years. So QPR will be on in April in 2018. And that is also a fantastic opportunity to hear about the research that is done in the HDR space. And this is actually something that a lot of HDR administrators are not connecting very strongly with the huge amount of research that is being done by educationalists, sociologists, and other academics into postgraduate research. And some of this is incredibly informative and valuable. And so would encourage you to, if possible, attend QPR. Its companion conference is run by Stellenbosch University in South Africa in the Postgraduate Supervision Conference, slightly smaller, slightly less of a profile, but that's run in odd years. So I was there in just a few months ago. And the focus there is more strongly, of course, on supervision. But I'd certainly strongly encourage HDR administrators. It's important to know the government documents, important to know the frameworks and guidelines, but also important to know, to keep track of the blogs and the research as well. So, thanks.